What if the real problem with Talkin' Sopranos isn't the guests at all, but the hosts who can't stop talking over them? The great irony of a podcast devoted to one of television's most incisive depictions of delusion is that its own hosts seem blissfully unaware of their own. Talkin' Sopranos often plays less like a retrospective on a landmark series and more like a wistful support group for performers still convinced the public hangs on every detail of their career trajectories. The audience arrives hoping for insight into the show's creation, character psychology, or production craft. What they receive instead is a prolonged celebration of professional networking, as if the origin story of who met whom in the lobby of an irrelevant playhouse were the cultural lodestone everyone tuned in to hear. This tendency was on full display during the interview with the costume designer, a guest who could have offered genuine substance. Viewers might reasonably expect discussion of how a wardrobe was built for a fictional crime family, research into real mob fashion, the logistics of obtaining period-appropriate pieces, or the fate of costumes after filming. Instead, the conversation devolved immediately into an extended resume recital. Every answer circled back to the same creative void. I met one person who led to another person who led to this job. The hosts responded with breathless astonishment, as though discovering that working in an industry occasionally leads to employment were a revelation worthy of archival preservation. And then there is Steve Sharippa, whose interviewing style resembles an air raid siren with nothing urgent to announce. Loud, perpetually aggrieved, and constitutionally incapable of letting an interesting point breathe, he bulldozes nuance with declarations of being a regular guy, a phrase he wields like a verbal mosquito repellent meant to keep depth at bay. Every question directed toward him is met with dismissive shrugging, as though meaning itself were an imposition. His energy suggests not a host guiding a conversation, but a man trapped in a perpetual grievance about an airline ticket purchased in 1997. Michael Imperioli, for his part, attempts to elevate the discourse, though his efforts often veer into theatrical self-admiration. The constant references to dear friends and obscure artistic endeavors may be more palatable than Sharippa's bluster, but they hardly bring the audience closer to understanding the show they came to revisit. When either host approaches insight, the moment dissolves, usually courtesy of Steve, into irrelevant digressions or self-congratulation. The tragedy is that the podcast occasionally proves how good it could be. Guests like Al Sapienza and David Proval offer genuinely thoughtful commentary, brief flashes of illumination swallowed by a format more invested in professional nostalgia than exploration. Even David Chase appeared visibly bored by the hosts' preoccupation with their own career lore, a man forced to sit through the least compelling footnotes to his own creation. The effect is a series that promises a return to the layered brilliance of The Sopranos, but delivers a skim of anecdotal trivia, 90% cliff notes, 10% insight. What could have been a goldmine of behind-the-scenes richness becomes a reminder that some performers remain entranced by the mythology of their own industry long after everyone else has stopped applauding. In the end, Talkin' Sopranos stands as an accidental commentary on fame itself, a space where two hosts recount their showbiz journeys, while the audience waits, perpetually, for the conversation to return to the thing that actually mattered. Stop buying into the fantasy that Richie Aprile ever posed a real threat to the Soprano hierarchy. Richie Aprile was always generous with threats he had no intention of living up to. His grand promise to dismantle Christopher piece by piece if he ever laid a hand on Adriana was especially rich, given that Richie himself would eventually be dismantled, quite literally, at Satriale's, by Christopher and Furio. Poetic symmetry, if one enjoys that sort of thing. His downfall, of course, came after a particularly triumphant moment in which he allowed himself to be roasted for the side effects of his blood pressure medication. Apparently, the man was better now, though the subsequent chain of events suggests otherwise. The universe, always attentive, seemed to be taking notes. Raise a hand to a woman who isn't one's wife? Exactly the unforgivable act Richie once used to threaten Christopher, and the cosmic ledger responds in kind. Even for a character of Richie's modest narrative height, the arc was nothing short of monumental. This was also the moment when the cobwebs were removed, as one might say. A sudden clarity revealing that Richie was not long for this world. Some might even diagnose him with metaphorical Lou Gehrig's disease, a terminal case of thinking he could outmaneuver Tony Soprano. As for who actually knew what, the situation was predictably murky. Christopher and Furio were informed only that Richie had been killed and were tasked with disposing of what remained. Tony had already decided to eliminate Richie after learning about his attempt to enlist Albert and Jr. in a move against him, an attempt both men wisely rejected, choosing the devil they knew over a ticking time bomb in leather. Then fate, always eager to rush the job, delivered a convenient twist. Richie struck Janice, Janice shot Richie, and suddenly Tony no longer needed to schedule an execution. Janice phoned him, he summoned Christopher and Furio, and the cleanup began. The irony of the entire affair is exquisite. Janice had spent so much time manipulating Richie into challenging Tony, an uncanny reprise of Livia and Junior's earlier conspiracy, only to neutralize both Richie and herself in a single gunshot. Her impulsive violence effectively removed her as a serious threat for the remainder of the series. Tony, for his part, never learned that Janice had been actively encouraging Richie's little coup. In true Soprano fashion, the people who deserved consequences rarely received them, while those who merely got in the way received them in spectacular fashion. Never confuse Tony's fury for a death sentence. He killed betrayal, not honest mistakes. The great tragedy of Adriana La Cerva is that her demise was less a matter of fate than of spectacularly poor decision-making. Hers, the FBI's, and above all, the men who claimed to love her. The question of whether lawyering up the moment agents dragged her into an interrogation room would have saved her is almost comically simple. Of course it would have. At that early stage, the government had nothing substantial, not even the shoddy digital evidence that later became their crutch. Refusing to cooperate wasn't just a viable option, it was the best option. Yes, Tony Soprano would have been furious. After all, an undercover agent had slipped through the doors of both his home and the Crazy Horse. But rage is practically his resting state, and in this case, it would have been tempered by the obvious. Adriana had no idea she was escorting trouble into the family's inner sanctum. It was an honest mistake, the kind his organization specializes in surviving. Collaboration with the FBI, however, was a different species of failure entirely. The moment she knowingly sat down across from federal agents, her fate was notarized. What makes the situation even more absurd is the misplaced fear of legal consequences. The cocaine distribution charge hanging over her head was vague enough to crumble under the weight of a competent defense attorney, an attorney Tony himself would almost certainly have provided. With proper counsel, she likely would have escaped with probation or house arrest, if anything at all. The personal fallout would have been far more severe than the legal. Christopher would have detonated in predictable fashion, and Tony would have nudged him toward the nearest exit from the relationship. The real surprise is that no one in this supposedly tight-knit criminal ecosystem ever thought to prepare their orbiting partners for the possibility of being pinched. For all the talk of loyalty and family, the organization invested remarkably little in teaching its loved ones how not to implode under pressure. Earlier in the series, Adriana showed flashes of competence, but by the time the FBI arrived, she had been softened into the perfect liability. Had she alerted Christopher immediately, before signing anything, before spilling anything, the entire affair could have been redirected. The family could have given her a lawyer or a strategy. They might have even used her as a conduit to feed the FBI misinformation, a classic maneuver somehow overlooked by everyone involved. Instead, she was left to improvise her way into catastrophe. In the end, the choice was never between death and prison. It was between trusting the people who claimed to protect her and trusting the people who intended to use her. She chose the latter, and the former repaid the mistake with murder. The tragedy is that silence, counsel, and a shred of guidance would have saved her. The farce is that no one in her world cared enough to offer it. Here's what no one admits about The Sopranos. The show punishes arrogance more brutally than any rival crew ever could. Few shows understand the dark comedy of misguided bravado as exquisitely as The Sopranos. The series treats power moves the way nature treats hubris, with immediate punishment and a hint of cosmic mockery. Every swaggering gesture detonates in its owner's face, often spectacularly. Take Doc Santoro, who made the fatal mistake of eating from Phil Leotardo's plate, an act meant to telegraph dominance, but instead served as his last meal. Or Tony, who forced Christopher to discard a harmless mud stick, only to find himself nearly shot by the same man later. Apparently, antagonizing volatile individuals for sport is not the shortcut to unquestioned authority. Jackie Jr. offered a masterclass in delusional theatrics during his sit-down with Matouche, presenting himself as a budget Don Corleone, complete with the chin-resting hand pose. His attempt at underworld gravitas was so unconvincing that even Matouche, jaw wired shut, managed to deliver the cutting observation that they don't think highly of you. If Jackie wanted authenticity, he could have leaned into the full parody and lamented never being invited to share a slice and a soft drink of choice with his supposed peers. Fat Dom made a similarly suicidal play while visiting Silvio and Carlo on their home turf. He strolled in from New York, assuming geography granted him immunity, then proceeded to insult Vito and imply Carlo's sexuality, a bold strategy if the objective was immediate death. Despite certain New Yorkers dismissing the Jersey crew as a glorified satellite, the Sopranos organization remained a sovereign family in every functional sense. Mobsters by trade, not schoolchildren. Dom's behavior defied even the most elastic interpretation of their timeless rules about respect. No rationale exists that could place him on the right side of the situation. Stupidity was his only defense, and not a compelling one. Even established leaders stumbled into hubris. Johnny Sack, on the verge of pressuring Tony into delivering up his cousin, declared their clandestine meetings undignified. Tony responded with a reminder that dignity rarely survives negotiation, an invitation for Johnny, Phil, and anyone else to go take a long walk off a short pier, in tone if not in phrasing. The tragicomic fallout of these blunders often extended well beyond the original power play. Consider the poker game Jackie Jr. attempted to rob, inspired by Ralphie's ill-advised storytelling. One patron, a man who spoke exclusively in idioms, offering gems like, "Victory has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan," ended up shot by a strung-out accomplice. Jackie's attempt at mafia ascension ended precisely where such hubris tends to lead. Some missteps were smaller, but no less ruinous. A certain assemblyman learned this when a public beating led to the end of his relationship with Irina, which in turn triggered a phone call to Carmela divulging old infidelities, an entire domestic implosion sparked by a single, impulsive display of dominance. Tony didn't even want Irina back. He simply couldn't stomach her dating someone else. There were, however, rare figures who refused to participate in the ballet of ego. Officer Wilmore stood his ground, writing Tony a ticket without flinching. Even after losing his job, he declined a payoff meant to ensure a fountain's safe arrival, walking away with the quiet resolve of someone immune to intimidation. An accidental stoic, the strong, silent type the others pretended, often disastrously, to be. Don't expect the FBI to swoop in just because two wise guys basically spell out a hit on the phone. The great unanswered question in mob world jurisprudence remains this: would Carmine actually skate after making that spectacularly unsubtle phone call to Tony? After all, his delicately coded message amounts to little more than naming the target out loud and then feigning confusion. The line, "You saying what I think you're saying?" does nothing except underline, twice in red ink, exactly what he's saying. If federal agents were listening, the subtlety level hovers somewhere between a foghorn and a fireworks display. Yet the inconvenient reality is that such a call, glaringly suspicious though it may be, still sits in the purgatory of not quite evidence. Prosecutors need more than implication, winks, and mobster euphemisms. They need proof that eliminates reasonable doubt, not a conversation that merely suggests two men might be circling around a murder plot. Since the audience is privy to later scenes where they openly discuss the hit, it's tempting to retroactively assign that certainty to the call. But courts don't get the director's cut. Even if the feds recognized the call for what it almost certainly was, they couldn't hang a full case on it. They might watch Johnny more closely, Perhaps even hope for a miraculous confession from someone suddenly seized by civic-mindedness? But suspicion isn't an indictment. Criminal organizations thrive on this gap. Multi-million-dollar enterprises do not survive by speaking in clear, prosecutable sentences. This is why federal agencies build RICO cases with the patience of monks, stacking 50 counts in hopes that 10 will stick. Of course, the entire exchange isn't helped by the mob's flair for the absurd. There's the running critique of wardrobe choices. A Don apparently forfeits all authority the moment he puts on shorts. The logic is charmingly deranged. Either Johnny volunteered this fashion report, which is bizarre, or Carmine asked, which is even more bizarre. But comfort must always bow to image, even when murder is on the agenda. In the end, the phone call remains exactly what it is: suspicious, sloppy, and dripping with mobster theatrics, yet still conveniently vague enough to protect everyone involved. A triumph of plausible deniability wrapped in grease paint bravado, delivered by a man whose lips announce every thought a half-second before he does. Stop pretending Silvio's absence was mysterious. It wasn't mysterious. It was avoidable. Silvio Dante remains the great unsolved mystery of The Sopranos. A character so compelling, so consistently funny, and so quietly competent that the series seemed almost determined to hide him from view. The show offers tantalizing flashes, just enough to prove he could have carried far more narrative weight, before promptly shoving him back into the shadows so another supporting character could enjoy yet another extended detour or identity crisis. The glimpses that do appear are priceless. Whether managing the bada bing with deadpan flair, or diffusing Christopher's chaotic tantrums by labeling him an unhappy customer, Silvio delivers comedy with the resignation of a man who long ago accepted that he works with lunatics. His talent for understated absurdity shines through in throwaway moments. Repairing broken ceramics, polishing shoes like a ritual of sanity, or barking the immortal culinary directive, "Hey, cheese, get me some food." Even his exasperation while serving as de facto boss, shouting from a hospital bathroom stall to break up an argument over robbery proceeds, outperforms full story arcs given to others. And then there is the lingering question: why so little? Why is the audience granted endless subplots about Vito's sexuality, Bobby's domestic adventures, and Polly's assorted scavenger hunts, while Silvio is allotted little more than the Columbus Day incident and the occasional strategic sigh? The character has a daughter apparently the same age as Meadow, yet the show treats her like a classified secret. His home life, personality, history, even his taste in gourmets, presumably far less explosive than Tony's, remain largely untouched. The explanation, of course, sits behind the camera. Steven Van Zandt, a magnetic performer but not a seasoned screen actor at the time, was never pushed beyond what the production believed he could comfortably deliver. He also had an open ticket to leave and tour with Springsteen, particularly around season 5, which naturally limited the writer's ambitions. The result is a character designed to intrigue, yet structurally sidelined. Ironically, Silvio was once envisioned as the boss. David Chase reportedly told Van Zandt that the role should have been his before network interference redirected the crown to a fat man from Jersey doing his best Gary Cooper impression. The series thus kept the crown on Tony's head, while keeping one of its most promising players on permanent reserve. For anyone craving the version of Silvio the show never gave, there is always Lilyhammer, a spiritual sideways sequel stuffed with references, winks, and precisely the tone Silvio loyalists seem destined to seek elsewhere. In the end, Silvio Dante remains the show's great what if. The man who could glue together broken ceramics, but was never granted the narrative space to hold the family, or the series, together. Subscribe for more.